I think also the court's decision gives some degree of cover for those who want to attack diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at colleges and universities, because it basically says diversity isn't a legible concept. And so those attacks are likely to have some additional legitimacy because of the court's decision.
Great to see so much interest in our topic today. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to Heterodox Academy's virtual event on a very important topic, which is how will the college admissions ruling change diversity in higher education? I'm Michael Regnier. I'm the executive director at HxA, as we lovingly call it. And I have three wonderful scholarly guests who have all written on this topic, actually. And so I'll briefly introduce them now. Renu Mukherjee is a PhD candidate in political science at Boston College, where her dissertation is about affirmative action. Rachel Moran is a professor at the Texas A&M School of Law. And my colleague, Musa Al-Garbi, has an updated bio. He's still the Daniel Bell Research Fellow at HxA. He's now also assistant professor of communication and journalism at Stony Brook University. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to take a moment to remind everybody about our norms, not just for these events, but for all of our events at HxA, especially when it's something as sensitive and contested as race in college admissions. We like to be the people who advocate for this HxA way. It matters here more than ever. That we're able to help make each other smarter on these topics. And the way we like to do that is to make our case with evidence, be intellectually charitable, be intellectually humble, be constructive, and be ourselves. So I'll encourage everybody in the chat. You've probably heard us say that 1,000 times, but please follow that, and we'll do our best here in the event as well. As a reminder, you can drop your questions in the Q&A box, or if you see a great question in there, you can upvote it. And we'll be spending some time making sure that a selection of the questions that are asked in the chat can be posed to our panelists. Finally, before we get started, let me just encourage everyone, if you're not a member of Heterodox Academy, we are now more than 6,000 academic insiders working for open inquiry, viewpoint, diversity, and constructive disagreement in the US, in Canada, and around the world. If you are a professor, a graduate student, or you work in higher ed in some other way, we'd love to have you as a member, and membership is free at heterodoxacademy.org. So you can also subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media, and we hope today will be a nice taste of what we try to do here at HxA, and that you'll consider becoming a member. Okay, well, with plugs out of the way, I'm going to stop sharing. And we will talk a little bit about our topic for today. So this topic would have been a bit of a different conversation even a couple of months ago, but obviously we're all grappling now with the implications of the Supreme Court's decision in the case of Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, which also involved the University of North Carolina. As most of our audience knows, this decision rendered unconstitutional some of the uses of racial preferences that were involved in college admissions practices at those two institutions. But it's also left a lot of questions, both about what the decision means, how higher ed institutions will react, how they should react, and also it brings up a lot of longstanding debates about the role of diversity and identity and merit and fairness in the practice of selecting who attends our colleges and universities, especially the most selective and so-called elite ones. So again, I'm thrilled to have such an esteemed panel with us today. Let's start out with some of the basics about the decision, and then we can sort of expand from there. And Rachel, I think I'll ask you the first question as our resident law professor. What should we understand about the essentials of this decision? What does it change in terms of the court's jurisprudence about college admissions?
Well, the court was really addressing a paradigm that was rooted in the Bakke decision from 1978. And there, Justice Powell said, diversity is a compelling interest. And for that reason, because colleges and universities have institutional autonomy, academic freedom to compose the student body, they can use race if they have diversity as a compelling interest to justify that. But because it's race, anything that you do must be narrowly tailored to serve that interest. And so if there are race neutral alternatives available, you must use those. And I really think what's real critical here is, first of all, the court said, yes, of course, institutions have academic freedom. So they did recognize the autonomy, but said that didn't justify diversity as a compelling interest because it was sort of judicially illegible. There were no metrics that allowed the courts to review whether diversity was actually conferring benefits. And so I think the most critical part of the decision is the discrediting of diversity as a compelling interest. In addition, the court said racial categories themselves are incoherent. And they cited the examples of Latinos, Middle Easterners, Asian Americans as being so internally different, heterogeneous, that it didn't make sense to actually treat them as a category. So I think those were critical moves by the court. But the court also said that there hadn't been narrow tailoring, that they had used race consistently from year to year so that the numbers, for example, of Blacks and Latinos in any given year looked the same. So it was quota-like. It was racial balancing. And they also said there was no endpoint, that Harvard and the University of North Carolina could not wean themselves from the use of race or even say when they might be able to do it. And they said in Grutter, which was a 2003 case against the University of Michigan, Justice O'Connor said she hoped this would not be necessary in 25 years. It was a few years more before we would get to 25 years, but they said there just wasn't an end in sight and there needed to be an end point. And I think they also believed that there were credible race neutral alternatives that could be used.
So it sounds like this jurisprudence about, how could you possibly use the privileged category of race, given the Equal Protection Clause, has gone through this evolution, and there's been different types of exceptions that the court has considered possible, but in this case, they say we're just too far past that. These institutions have overstepped and not stayed within that narrowly tailored grounds. I have heard observers on left and right say that there's potentially some wiggle room built into this decision. And there is a notable passage that describes and I guess warns institutions to watch out for trying to just do the same thing again through essays. And yet we've seen a lot of colleges make announcements focusing on what some see as sort of a loophole in that language. Rainu, can I ask you to weigh in on that? How do you see that the decision and that really crucial portion that talks about the role of using essays and how universities should think about race?
Sure. So what was really interesting was even less than an hour after the court released that decision, around 10 a.m., we saw messages released from Harvard University's president, the University of North Carolina, and really colleges and universities throughout the United States, quoting that portion of Chief Justice Roberts' opinion, saying, while the court has struck down the overt use of racial preferences for underrepresented minorities in elite college admissions, college education admissions broadly as well, you still can speak about your race if it's tied to, for example, overcoming disadvantage or adversity in a holistic way. What's really interesting, though, is that the immediate sentence after that portion of Roberts' opinion says, though, as you alluded to, Michael, this is not simply a backdoor way in which colleges can, in fact, discreetly grant racial preferences. And he also references the two dissenting opinions from Justices Sotomayor and Jackson, in which they suggest, perhaps colleges and universities can turn to student essays in more of a holistic review sense. So it seems as though institutions of higher education throughout the US have clung onto that one sentence in Roberts's opinion and ignored the rest. And I feel like that's much to their detriment. They are going to face further lawsuits if they do try to incorporate racial preferences through a more covert method. Edward Blum, who was behind Students for Fair Admissions and other cases concerning racial preferences, also came out after the decision saying that he and his organization are going to keep a close eye on colleges and universities. So I do anticipate there to be further litigation if, as it seems, colleges are going to kind of pursue a backdoor method toward granting racial preferences.
Yeah, and I'd love to explore sort of how practical we think that might be, but I want to make sure I bring in my colleague Musa. Musa, come on in on this question. What's on your mind?
Yeah, my concern, one concern that I have looking at the ruling and the way that some universities have already responded to the ruling is that there's a sense in which if schools rely more heavily on essays, and especially on essays to where people appeal to their identity or background and their history of overcoming adversity as a means of selecting people, in many respects, that could result in an even more regressive selection policy than we already have. So there is all sorts of research that shows that, for instance, essay content more closely tracks familial income than SAT scores do. There's work that's done by sociologists like Lauren Rivera that finds that one of the benefits of going to like elite K-12 schools is that you learn how to write these kind of compelling stories for gatekeepers at elite institutions. So you can tell the kind of story that they're looking for. Someone who comes from the bottom, rose to the top, but still keeps it real, a kind of bootstrapping Horatio Alger story. Whereas people from less advantaged backgrounds, to the extent that they write about adversity at all, oftentimes they try to hide actually some of the adversity that they overcame. They think it'd be embarrassing or detrimental. But they also don't write about it in the same way. So they focus, for instance, on all the people in their life who helped them rather than talking about the heroic things that they did and things like that. And those stories don't tend to resonate as well with the people making decisions. So to the extent that they focus more on these kind of essay content, especially essay content that's designed to like tug at the heartstrings of people who do admissions at Harvard and things like that, it's going to be students from affluent backgrounds and students from who attended like elite private K-12 schools that are going to be advantaged in that selection criteria in an even more dramatic way than if they're just making, in a sort of blanket way, giving advantage to people on the basis of race.
So it seems like we've already gotten to the next step of our conversation, which I think is on everyone's mind. Higher ed is not a static system. One change leads to another. So Renu mentioned the potential for lawsuits. Musa, you talked about, if criteria are changing to focus more on subjective things, and I also know, many universities are dropping standardized tests or reducing their importance. I'd love to hear from everyone. Granted, we're all speculating, but with this many moving pieces, what's the equilibrium that might emerge over the next few years? I mean, Rachel, you've probably thought about this. Let me ask you for starters, what do we think the new normal is going to be, or will there be one?
Well, I think, we already mentioned the possibility that there will be litigation because the essays are used in some way that subverts the race neutrality of the process. But I do think there's a real question about what race neutrality means, because many universities are likely to consider other criteria, socioeconomic status, zip code, percentage plans, doing away with standardized tests. There's many things that you might do, considering first generation status. And the Pacific Legal Foundation has already said, if you use these proxies with the desire to promote racial and ethnic diversity, that's impermissible, because you can't take these steps based on a racial motivation. So I'm sure there will be litigation, and there's already been test litigation against two at least 2 selective high schools, in which they said that the high schools redid their admissions criteria to promote diversity, and that was impermissible. Now, that litigation hasn't uniformly succeeded, but I do think it's laying the groundwork for the challenges in higher education to come. I think the other destabilization that you're seeing is the legacy admissions. On the front page of the New York Times today was an announcement that the Office for Civil Rights is investigating Harvard's preferences for legacy admissions, alleging that it advantages privileged whites. Now, the question is whether that was racially motivated. Because if it was actually motivated by a desire to generate money from people who can make large donations, for example, or to recruit faculty, or to maintain good alumni relations, Harvard could say, we did this and it did incidentally benefit whites, but that's because most wealthy people in America who can make large donations are white. Most of our alumni are white because of prior admissions in another era. And the faculty pool is mostly white. And so I think there will be ongoing debates about what is racially motivated and impermissible and what is race neutral on both sides.
I wonder whether the legal importance on sort of almost an institution's state of mind or motivations and these sort of wink and nod kind of practices and admissions doesn't actually hurt the academy in some way. I mean, we talk a lot about being a truth-seeking organization and being open in our arguments. It seems a little cloak and dagger and not necessarily going to get better. I mean, Renu, does that worry you?
It does worry me. And actually, one of my colleagues here at the Manhattan Institute, Robert Verbruggen, in early June, a few weeks before SCOTUS released this decision, had published a report on what race-neutral alternatives are going to look like and how they might affect the higher education landscape. And his conclusion, one of his focus cases was the University of California system in the aftermath of Proposition 209, was that this is just going to drive everything further underground. And also in the sense that if you have, for example, an explicit racial preference, now this is of course something that I don't support. The court has recognized in my mind, rightfully so, that it violates the Equal Protection Clause. But in that sense, if you're an admissions officer and you have, say, a racial quota of you want 15% underrepresented minorities in your incoming class, you're going to do your admission scheme to just, include about 15%. But if you can't have that explicitly anymore and you have to turn to instead race neutral alternatives that are in fact racial proxies, you're going to be applying that over a much greater percentage than just, the target you have in mind to then yield your target. So you might have to, extend that to 30% to then end up yielding 15%. So I think that this is going to drive everything further underground and also actually lead to larger preferences that are then going to have, greater academic mismatch effects, for example. And so I do think things are going to get a bit worse before they get better.
Musa, you've looked a lot as a sociologist at winners and losers, different perceptions, different motivations in this whole storm. How do you see it playing out?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I have concern about that I alluded to briefly before was that a lot of the alternative metrics that schools would use to select people in lieu of what they're currently doing can actually be really easily gamed by like wealthy families, and can in some respects be gamed even more easily than the existing metrics. So for instance, you can at schools like UPenn, for instance, so a lot of schools are trying to provide advantage to first-gen students or to students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay, but how they define that is very important. So at UPenn, for instance, you count as a first-generation student if your parents didn't graduate from an Ivy League school. So if you're someone who's the son of a doctor who graduated from University of Arizona and a lawyer who graduated from Arizona State, you count as a first-gen student when you apply to UPenn, which is, wild. UCLA, similarly, you count as a first-gen student if your parents didn't graduate from a school in the United States. So if you're, again, a child of a doctor and a lawyer, but one went to Oxford and the other graduated from Cambridge, you count as a first-gen student. And the problem is institutions have an incentive because they want to, amp up their numbers, their diversity numbers. They want to show that they're, achieving. So the institutions as well actually have a kind of a perverse incentive to structure these things in such a way that they can still get the kind of affluent people that they're aiming for, but also make it look like they're really diverse and inclusive. And that's what you're seeing already at a number of institutions. And I think that's going to get worse. And then just briefly, I'll say on the flip side as well, you're seeing rich families, affluent families already gaming some of these systems. So for instance, a trend that's already underway and will probably get worse is that you have people from affluent families legally emancipating their children so that their children then they don't count the parents' income anymore, and the children generally have zero income because they're not working, and so they can qualify then as for they get an admissions advantage in virtue of being a low-income student technically, and they get to go to school for free instead of their families paying the $80,000 a year at Columbia, for instance. And so this is already a thing that's happening. It will probably get worse if they're put increased weight on socioeconomic disadvantage. So as I'm looking forward, a lot
Absolute
of the alternative
chaos.
things are just really easy to game.
Yeah, I think there is a lot to game out. I appreciate our heterodox panelists for actually being so compliant as I'm calling on you, but I'm going to stop doing that. We can open this up a little bit. I will also say in the chat, in the Q&A, just remind everyone who's watching live, please share your questions because we'll be getting to those and we'd love to hear what's on your mind. So here's a big question then. Whatever the jurisprudential legal merits of the decision from a legal perspective, and whatever we think about exactly how it's going to be implemented in the future, universities and colleges do have choices to make now. And even though many of them may make very similar kind of isomorphic choices where they all kind of veer in the same direction, we believe around here it's good to debate these things and talk about them. So what should they do? I mean, after this decision, what is the best approach to admissions? Is it strictly test score cutoffs? Is there some kind of balancing that should be in there? I'd love to hear from any of the panelists on that.
I mean, I'll just briefly to just, I'll just say it's actually hard. I mean, like, so everyone, well, not everyone, but it's, I guess, broadly agreed that diversity is good or important or whatever. And a lot of students, when they're deciding what colleges to go for, do actually pay attention to how diverse it is or isn't. We know this on a number of lines, including gender lines. But one of the things that's striking is that a lot of the low-hanging kind of obvious things that people might think would work well turn out to be a lot more complicated than in practice. So for instance, one proposal that's been getting a lot of play, I'll just briefly mention this and then let other people talk, is this idea of selecting people on the basis of their zip codes. But they've done pilots in San Francisco, for instance, for the elite K-12 schools to select people on the basis of zip codes. And what happened in practice actually was the schools actually got more segregated, more racially segregated after they implemented this. And that happened because a lot of the sort of affluent families moved to the very frontier of the areas that were considered as low socioeconomic status so that their kids would get an advantage. And in doing so, they actually crowded out all of this, the lower income and minority students who would have otherwise, on the basis of their merits, qualified to get in. They couldn't anymore because these wealthy people who have even better preparation moved into the neighborhood and took their spot. And so something like that like a zip code selection thing seems like it's something that would be a good way to get socioeconomic diversity in practice. It actually increased segregation when it was piloted in San Francisco, and I'm sure a similar thing would hold true in Harvard or other places like that. And so that's just something to be mindful of, is a lot of the things that seem like kind of obvious alternatives to get like socioeconomic diversity or things like that, in practice, very complicated.
Yeah.
I'll just add to what Moose is just saying right now on using zip codes as a race neutral alternative. And Rachel kind of alluded to this earlier, but looking at how race neutral alternatives of this sort are currently playing out at the selective exam school level in cities like Boston and San Francisco. In Boston, for example, under their current new admissions system that combines admissions test, cumulative GPA, and then also admissions tips based on the zip code within the city. One of the issues that the Boston Public Schools and the school committee have run into is that they have not defined zip code clearly enough. And an example of this is it really shows the difficulties in implementing socioeconomic admissions tips, and how not only school districts, but also universities and colleges are going to have to really think hard about how best they can do this to achieve the sort of socioeconomic diversity they want. So for example, one of the starkest issues that Boston Public Schools has run into is that they base their socioeconomic admissions tip for their 3 exam schools not on median household income, but on percentage of the zip code population living below the poverty line. What this has led to is some of the most affluent neighborhoods in Boston have, for example, one public housing project. And there are several lower middle class neighborhoods that don't have any sort of public housing project. So what this has in effect led to is that the zip codes that are lower to middle class but have no public housing project are effectively shut out of the exam schools because of the socioeconomic admissions tip. Meanwhile, these affluent neighborhoods that just have one housing project, those students, coming from families where the median household income is $200,000, $300,000, are getting preferential treatment in the admissions process for the exam schools. So, this is something that colleges and universities, if they try to go down this route, are going to have to think really hard about, because, just speaking, just upfront, a socioeconomic admissions tip for low-income applicants sounds really easy, but what does that in fact mean is something that I think these institutions haven't necessarily grappled with.
I'll just add that I don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all response, nor should there be. We have a great diversity among our colleges and universities. They have different missions. They serve different constituencies. And so I don't really think we should expect the same response. And just speaking for a moment to the University of California, we are a state institution. We serve the people of California. So we have some regional constraints that Harvard doesn't have, for example. Working within that, when I was at the University of California, Berkeley, after Proposition 209, I don't think we thought we were going to use covert means. We felt we were a law school. We had to comply with the law. We had to respect the will of the people. On the other hand, we did think there were pedagogical benefits to diversity. So we had to find ways to do more outreach and recruitment, to send a message that we were still a welcoming institution. We also created some marquee programs that we thought would attract people based on their interest in social justice work, that would help us to preserve our pedagogical values. And we did that, and we continued to use standardized tests and grades. Now, there is research on what happened at the University of California after 209. And it's interesting, we generally did outreach and recruitment. There was a percentage plan. Different schools adopted different marquee programs. But according to one study, the main driver of diversity at the university has been demographic change. You can't serve the population of high school students in California without having diverse colleges and universities, just because of the demographic makeup. And that's why Berkeley and Michigan both filed an amicus brief, but they're minority white campuses now, but that's because of the demography of the state. I think it's going to be different at Harvard because it is a global university. It brings in people from all over the world. They've had a long tradition of legacy admissions. We as public institutions in California couldn't do that. We didn't have legacy admissions. So we ought to expect diverse strategies and diverse approaches because places have different goals and values and histories and traditions.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Rachel, because I do think that there's an important set of questions here about what are the implications from Harvard and UNC out to the rest of higher ed. You mentioned state universities. For context, Rachel's coming from the U of C system, even though she's going to A&M now. We also got a question in the chat about what will this decision mean for other aspects of university life. I know law review board admissions have been paused at certain institutions. But anyone who'd like to weigh in, what should we expect? Obviously, it won't be limited to the Harvards and UNCs of the world, but what are some of the other ripple effects of this decision coming out? And maybe they're going to play out differently than in the most selective colleges.
I think Rachel's point is is super important, as has been talked about in a number of other contexts in the context of the sort of affirmative action, broader social debate. It is the case that for most colleges and universities in America, they don't even have to worry about questions like balancing or anything like this. They're just trying to get enough students to keep the doors open and keep the lights on and keep the faculty hired. And so they don't have to, it's not even an option for them. They don't have enough candidates and they don't really turn down as so many people. And so for most of those schools, the kind of admissions component of the affirmative action ruling probably isn't super salient. It's more relevant at selective schools. But that said, the affirmative action ruling is already having an effect on hiring in the private sector. For instance, there are already lawsuits that are underway appealing to the to the recent SCOTUS ruling and its argumentation vis-a-vis diversity and its rationale and things like this, to argue that considerations of diversity, even in private sector hiring, are something that maybe need to be considered. That will certainly have downstream impacts, for instance, with respect to how faculty are hired and promoted, with respect to possibly other staff members as well. But I feel like one important change, and that would be a change that would be much more broad. If there were pressure put on universities to change their hiring practices, especially as it relates to faculty, that is a kind of implication that would have much more broad impacts throughout the university system, not just at selective schools, because almost every university, as I understand it, even if they're not super selective in terms of admissions, do try to prioritize diversity in their hiring practices. And so I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch going forward.
I would add, within the field of higher education, I see several possible implications. One is that a lot of accrediting agencies include diversity criteria as part of that process. I believe those criteria will come under attack because the court said diversity is incoherent. We don't even know what it means. I think another area will be interesting to watch is the federal funding for minority serving institutions. There have already been statements that, for example, there should not be funding based on the proportion of Hispanic enrollments. HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, are the most rapidly growing because the Latino population is rapidly growing. And the claim was you shouldn't have an enrollment threshold in order to trigger federal funding that's based on race or ethnicity. I think that will be attacked. And that money mainly flows to less selective institutions that serve large proportions of Latino students. I think also the court's decision gives some degree of cover for those who want to attack diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at colleges and universities, because it basically says diversity isn't a legible concept. And so those attacks are likely to have some additional legitimacy because of the court's decision. And finally, the court did say that there are some institutions like military academies where they may have an interest in race that's different because, for example, they need to consider race to advance national security. The court said it would be open to that possibility. Also, the court this term decided a case in which a woman didn't want to make wedding websites for gay couples, and they said that she could be exempted from a general non-discrimination standard because of her free speech rights. Well, that's very interesting because you could say that composing the student body is an expressive act. And why then can you not be exempted based on your autonomy interests? I think the more interesting question is religious organizations, which have been given a lot of exemptions from discrimination laws based on their religious beliefs. Would they be able to make the claim that they should still be able to consider race? So I think those are all instances in which the schools are not necessarily the most highly selective institutions, but might still be affected.
So as I read the decision as a non-lawyer, I seem to perceive still some contemplation of the value of diversity. Obviously, the majority is always at pains to try to present the decision as very consistent with past precedent, even when that might feel like a stretch. But in the very fractured Bakke case, for example, the most famous opinion there talked about the value of other kinds of diversity. I'm going to try one more time to see if we can get some positive vision here about what universities should do. And I will actually call on you, Raina, because you've written about the Bakke case. Should that Justice Powell's imagining of, thinking of international travel and geographic origin and all kinds of other dimensions in the mix of diversity, is that still a live prospect? And should we go that way? Or does this decision just cut the heart out of that?
I don't think that this decision cuts the heart out of that. And I frequently write about Powell's opinion in Bakke because his vision of diversity, now, of course, in reading, sort of his papers and the notes he sent between his law clerks at the time, he viewed his opinion in Bakke as constituting a sort of middle ground between racial preferences in order to remedy adverse discrimination against African Americans in the US, and then also, this how to appease those who did not want any sort of racial preferences granted. So that's evident in sort of his papers. But his view of diversity being a multifaceted concept is quite poignant and important, and I think captures the pluralistic nature of the United States. It's unfortunate, however, because Bakke onward, simply because he said, race and ethnicity could be one factor among many in admissions decisions. That's what nearly all admissions officials clung onto in their understanding of diversity. And so for the last 45 years or so, we've understood diversity as being synonymous with race or ethnicity. When, and when Powell was describing diversity, he spoke about the student from Idaho, the farmer, he spoke about the pianist and the football player. And it is a really, interesting portrait of how he envisioned the United States being. And so I do think that there is still room for that. I mean, it seems as though Chief Justice Roberts tried to adhere to that. And both he and then also Justice Thomas in his concurrence kind of acknowledged that admissions officials have understood diversity in a very narrow focus. But that aside, I do think I think that this is sort of a wake-up call for admissions officials that, there are these other aspects that they ought to take into account. And I'm a bit hopeful that I think that they might begin to do so.
Well, I think we probably have members who'd like to consider what sort of viewpoint diversity means as part of that whole mix. We'll leave that as an exercise to the reader, as they say. But speaking of viewpoint diversity, it's not just on this panel, it's in our audience. And I'd like to do something we did at our last virtual event, which is a bit of a lightning round, posing some of the more interesting or some of the many interesting questions that came up in the Q&A. Don't feel obliged, panelists, to answer or weigh in on every single question. one or two, please feel free, and then we'll get more questions in that way. So one question came up. We've been talking almost entirely about the United States. Are there international implications here? I could imagine maybe some cultural precedents or something like that, but what does this mean outside of the US? Anyone? Musa, what do you think?
Well, I to the extent that it could matter for a lot of international students, to the extent that they change admissions, especially to the extent that they change admissions policies to place greater weight on things like essays, and they change what they look for in essays a little bit to try to get at this diversity in a backhanded way. That could have various implications for international aspirants who hope to come to the United States. That's the first thing that pops into my mind. I don't know if other people have.
I'm sure it'll be different in different places. I know there's, we don't need to be so America-centric. Many nations, Malaysia, for instance, has a affirmative action regime all its own, reflecting its own internal politics. Another question I'd like to ask is, a little bit more about legacy admissions. So Raifa in the chat makes the point that over time, some of the legacy admissions will actually involve alumni legacies, as they say, who are more and more people of color themselves. Do we think that that's going to affect the debate about potentially rolling back legacy admission policies?
What's interesting is that I have read opinion pieces, and Harvard's own student newspaper has done stories on this, not recently, but back in 2020 and earlier, for example, bringing up the point that, as Rachel's point, not specific to California, but in general, the demographics of the US change and it becomes more racially and ethnically diverse. There are greater opportunities for students of color, underrepresented minorities to gain admissions to these schools and, establish their own legacy at these institutions. So it's quite interesting that has been written before, but it seems as though the current debate in the last month or so after the court's decision has focused on how legacies currently stand, which are overwhelmingly white, and not the possibility, that there might be, a future in which you'd have greater Black students, you'd have more Asian Americans, for example. I think everybody's sort of looking at the current work that was done by Students for Fair Admissions' expert, Peter Arcidiacono, and then David Card, who was Harvard's expert, showing that whites are just so disproportionately benefiting from this policy, not potentially considering that in the future it could in fact benefit and be helpful for other racial groups in the US. So that's a really interesting question.
I think the class, I think there's an interesting class dynamic there, though. So for instance, Thomas Sowell has a book called Affirmative Action Across the World, Around the World, and there were a number of other studies that consistently find basically that up to now, the students who have benefited the most from the affirmative action as it's been structured in recent history have been traditionally the more advantaged members of the target groups. So when the affirmative action, when affirmative action was first put into place through executive order, the idea anyway was that it was in part to help rectify for historical exclusion and to help people who are sort of disadvantaged have some kind of ladder for social mobility. In practice, it's often had the effect of helping people who are from historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups, but who are themselves relatively advantaged, helping them kind of preserve or enhance their elite position. But it hasn't done too much for helping people who are sort of genuinely disadvantaged, rise up the ladder.
Right.
And so to the extent that there are, to the extent that alumni admissions could benefit people from historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups, it will be generally benefiting people who are already advantaged from those groups who took advantage of the existing policies to get into college and then themselves had a good career. And so it's not necessarily so sure the alumni advantage could help a larger share of minorities in the future than it did in the past. But would it actually be like creating social mobility or creating opportunities for people who are genuinely not advantaged? Not likely.
Thank you. I want to fit in one more question. This one comes from the chat. Actually, several questions were asked. So, okay, we take your point, Musa and Reinu, that zip codes can be manipulated. But states have tried things that are even more specific. And for example, looking at the school that you graduated from, what percentage of students were eligible for free and reduced price lunch at that school, kind of making it more and more granular, which if constitutionally universities need to focus there, maybe there's a lot of incentive to get the technicalities right. Any thoughts on the Texas system or other systems that have really tried to go to the top % of a school or the demographics of a school as a way to get around some of that gaming?
Well, I'll say like they tried to add what was called an adversity score for a while to standardized tests, which similarly looked at a similarly broad range of indicators, like in a somewhat fine-grained level, to try to produce a comparative score that would allow them to. And the idea behind that at the time when they tried to append this to the SAT was that there's this kind of intuition that we have that if two people accomplish the same feat, but one person had to overcome a lot more to accomplish that same feat, in a sense that second person is more meritocratic in a sense, right? They deserve it more. So this was piloted. It didn't end up taking off, though, in part because it faced like extremely fierce resistance that eventually led them to back down. I do wonder to what extent that, so to say there probably is kind of a way to get more fine grained that makes gaming difficult, but also one shouldn't underestimate the capacity of wealthy, well-connected people to understand the system and game the system. They're very good at it. They have the ability to do that. They can just pick up and move if they want to in ways that other people can't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just one thing to bear in mind, is that sure, there are ways to make it more difficult to game, I think, but rich people gonna game.
Can I just say a word about, first of all, the percentage plans in Texas? That was driven by concerns about a decision that had eliminated the use of affirmative action. But the reason that it succeeded in the legislature was because of a coalition with rural legislators who, regardless of the racial or ethnic makeup of their communities, had never had a kid from the high school in this small town, in West Texas, go to UT Austin. And so the feeling was opportunity is not being equally distributed around the state. I do want to mention one other thing, which I think undergirds this entire conversation. One way to deal with these decisions is to develop an even more discretionary system that is harder to penetrate in terms of what's going on, particularly if you're litigation averse. But the other way is to use our innovations in big data to create more evidence-driven, data-based approaches that can be increasingly granular. Now, I think actually of gerrymandering in voting districts, where they have sort of perfected the art of figuring out just how a household will vote. And so, will we develop better predictive measures of college success using that approach? I think that is a big divide in the conversation we've been having, and one that remains unresolved. So we'll see which direction becomes the dominant one.
I think actually that like one nice opportunity of the ruling, so the Supreme Court pushed back and said that there's not a lot of data, for instance, demonstrating the value of diversity, and there's not a lot of measurement. So that's really an opportunity for social scientists, right? To really measure these things more, measure the impact more, define these things more clearly, collect more data on what the impacts of different structures are. I mean, as a social scientist, I think it's an important moment for us, and we'll see how that plays out in the coming years.
And I want to say part of the strategy of holistic review was not to have a lot of transparency, not to have a lot of data.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because the court said if it were judicially reviewable, if there was some meaningful measurement, we could revisit this, right? I don't think they believe there will be meaningful measurement, but I think schools really shied away from evaluating diversity on the ground because there were a lot of vested interest in the diversity programs, and politically it would have been seen as very delicate matter to go out and try to assess the efficacy of these programs. So it was just narrowly focused on the admissions numbers. And even there, you didn't want to have quotas. And so this tension between discretion and numbers-driven decision-making is very real. I will say, I think admissions in higher education has been pretty static for a long, long time. It doesn't look all that different from when I applied, even though the ways we manage information have been revolutionized, and that in itself is an interesting story.
So perhaps a time for innovation in this area with a different kind of scrutiny, maybe pushing us to figure out some other ways to do things. Musa, Rachel, thank you so much. Renu, any last thoughts before we let everybody plug their materials?
I was just going to, I'm reading the chat and there's lots of great comments about the elimination of standardized tests that we've seen, you know, of course, so it required sort of during the pandemic when this option was not available, but have continued. You know, Harvard has suspended standardized testing throughout 2026. Columbia became the first Ivy League to permanently go test optional. Interestingly, the UC system conduct permanently and test blind, so you can't even, you know, submit your scores in 2021 after doing an internal review, which found that test scores in the UC system were in fact more predictive of freshman year GPA and four-year graduation rate than high school GPA. So despite that finding, they still went ahead and went test blind anyway. So I think, you know, so much we focused on how schools are going to game this decision, and they're likely going to. But I think like one thing is, you know, perhaps instead of how you can have adversity scores and socioeconomic racial proxies, maybe also just, you know, don't get rid of standardized tests, sort of, you know, instead of going around it, try to kind of keep what you already have. So just thought I'd bring that up because there's a lot of interesting stuff in the chat about that.
Can I just add that MIT was going to do that and they discovered that they couldn't because they were admitting people who couldn't do the math that was necessary to succeed and even survive at MIT. So I think, you know, there will be different approaches at different schools.
Yeah, I just put a thing in the chat about from a director at MIT who was talking about why they reinstated it. Part of it was the preparation, and then part of it was also the admitted class they ended up getting was actually interestingly less diverse when they got rid of the standardized tests.
Well,
another example of how the apparently easy solutions are often more complicated in practice than we've seen.
Yeah. Well, a lot of change to follow and track. I appreciate everybody being here. Before we break, I'll ask each of our panelists, for those in the audience who've been interested in following your work, where can they find you online? Where can they read or listen more? I'll start with you, Rachel.
Well, I just finished at UC Irvine. I'm going to be moving to Texas A&M. And so I think I still have a website at Irvine, and I will have one at Texas A&M. And I appreciate all the thoughtful questions and engagement today, because members of the Academy will be critical to how the universities respond. And so your voices will be important, and it's wonderful to have this lively discussion.
Renu, where can we find you online?
So I am a PhD candidate over at Boston College, but you can I'm also a policy analyst at the Manhattan Institute. So you can find all of my writing on affirmative action, Asian American political behavior, and also my reports that I put out on these issues on the Manhattan Institute website under my page there. And you can also follow me at Rainu Mukherjee1 on Twitter.
Thank you so much. And Musa, how do we avoid you on the internet? No.
Yes.
Where do we find you?
Well, so if you're already on the Heterodox Academy website, I have a number of articles that I write that I have on the Heterodox Academy website on many of these issues. So you should definitely check out the blog and find my essays there. I have a website that I think was just put in the chat. It's my personal website, and I have a book coming out with Princeton University Press that touches on some of these same themes as well. And then last thing I'll just say, we didn't get to talk about it, so I really just want to put it on the table as we close. I think one important aspect of this ruling that hasn't been discussed much is the use of gender actually in admissions, because there's a very strong admissions preference right now provided for men. And I think that like stronger than a lot of the other preferences that they provide. And I think that the Supreme Court's ruling can really put pressure on that practice as well. And we'll have to see if a lawsuit ever happens on that. But I'm very interested. I think people should keep their eye on the gender question going forward.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, everyone. It's really been a pleasure, and I hope you all have a great day. Take care.